I think I'll start with this picture, which shows the two leaders, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India. Kind of shows, these nicer times when both these leaders shared good camaraderie. When summits were held in both China and India, despite actually another round of tensions that happened in Doklam in 2017. Even after that, the two countries managed to sort of reduce the tensions, the military tensions, and talk about issues of cooperation, including climate change. However, things are not the same today, and a lot of other factors have also played into this geopolitical conundrum, including COVID-19 pandemic and the border dispute, which seems to be recurring more often than usual. But it's important to kind of zoom into these two personalities because they have had a huge impact on climate diplomacy of their respective countries. They seem to have that, personality-driven sort of policies and diplomatic positions at the international level, which also sort of reflects, the national interests and so-called international aspirations of where do they see their countries, say, 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line. Therefore, it's very important to look at these two countries' climate diplomacy also from the position of geopolitics, as much as talking about, the linkages or interlinkages with the domestic politics, which is also important as we discuss the outcome of the recently held COP in Glasgow as well. So to go back, as I mentioned, it's important to sort of look at it a little bit historically as well, because this is where it all started, I would say it started before Copenhagen summit. Of course, since 1992 onwards, China and India have constantly cooperated as both these countries represent the developing countries' interests and all of that, which I will come to later. But where did this kind of come to a point where, China and India became sort of inseparable from each other, where the two countries were always sort of seen together with each other, not just in terms of, how they cooperated with each other, but also in terms of how the global north, the European Union, the US and others started seeing these two countries as some sort of a duo who need to act on climate change as much as the West does have to, based on historical responsibility and all these other principles that have been bedrocks of UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the 2009 Copenhagen Summit, I've just put two images here, and I show these images in most of the seminars, which talk about the rise of India and China in the climate change negotiations. It shows kind of a dejected faces of the European Union leaders and Barack Obama there, and how the decision was made at Copenhagen summit with the basic countries, that is Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, coming together to assert themselves and who's putting forth their positions in respect to the Copenhagen Accord and what can they do. This also came in just a year after the financial crisis hit. So 2007-8 financial crisis, which affected the Western countries a lot, did not seem to affect China and India as much because both these countries were still having high rates of GDP growth. Now, this is also very important as much as also talking about, the emissions rate as well. So both these countries, China exceeded the US as the largest greenhouse gas emitter. India became the third largest emitter. So with all these changes, the international pressure on China and India began to increase year by year. And this is something that started particularly after the Bali summit, the Bali Action Plan, which also set the agenda for the future of the climate order itself. So the basic countries coming together did indeed play a huge role, because this was something that was stitched up primarily by China and India. So the idea was something that was engendered by India, and then finally China also, India did approach China to, support this kind of developing country interests, which China was very happy with because they wanted to buy time and find more opportunities before they could commit to something much bigger as expected by the developed countries. Now, what are the drivers? So this kind of sets the tone for where Sino-Indian climate diplomacy is, where it became much more evident to the outside world, and how Copenhagen summit really bridged whatever differences were there between India and China was sort of bridged during the summit. As I mentioned, there was international pressure on account of growing greenhouse gas emissions. There was, of course, a visible change in the world order itself. And I think it's important to also juxtapose the geopolitical and geoeconomic world order with climate diplomacy, because I think they go hand in hand, as I mentioned, as I explained, how there were more expectations from India and China to act, right? So the geoeconomics, the geopolitical environment had changed significantly in the late 2000s, which also sort of affected the way the remaining COPs after Copenhagen, including Cancun, Durban, all these different summits were all affected by this changing geopolitical and geoeconomic scenario itself, especially when countries like Australia, Japan, Canada, they all were not happy, or in fact, even the European Union initially was not happy about signing on to the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol without sufficient promises by China primarily and India to a certain extent. So I'll come to this idea of clubbing these two together, which doesn't go well with India, which is also one of the major divergences. There is a historical legacy as well, which kind of is reflected in trade, climate change, all these different issues, which brings the countries together, whether it is the colonial legacy or the concept of South-South cooperation, which I'm not going into deeply, because these are historical sort of legacies which have affected or which have influenced a cooperation between China and India, even on other issues, including trade and sometimes even on political issues for that matter. There is ideational solidarity for sure. Like on issues of measuring, reporting, and verification, both these countries have staunchly supported this idea of sovereignty, where it would only be in the form of international consultation and not like interference in how they achieve their domestic targets, especially something that happens without international support. That is just one example, but sovereignty is something that is considered supreme. Historical responsibility of the West is, again, that is something talked about a lot in both these countries' positions. There is CBDRRC and, of course, national circumstances that guide climate policies of the country. So therefore, expecting more from developed world in terms of climate finance, technology transfer, and so on and so forth. Equity, climate justice, so equitable distribution of carbon space, which is something that India talks about even today, for that matter, when it talks about net zero emissions target and other such principles, right? Or other such initiatives. There are some similarities in the domestic scenario as well when it comes to energy dependence, say fossil fuel dependence, or how the energy systems are structured, because both these are developing countries. But there are differences, of course, considering China is like an industrialized or it is on the way to becoming an industrialized economy. It has a huge manufacturing sector, while India is still, it skipped that manufacturing or industrialization process and, kind of jumped into that services sector, primarily focusing on IT sector, right? So this is a story that is, of course, different. But yes, there are some similarities in terms of economic growth, potential, poverty, and other issues as well. The climate policy architecture, both the countries were favorable towards more of a bottom-up approach, where the nationally determined contributions or something like that would be much more acceptable to both of them. But we have to also keep in mind, do they have long-term interests? Now, this is a very important question to ask. And I think over a period of time, these countries, China and India, have started to diverge on many issues. The conceptualization of national interest is, of course, differing. It doesn't remain the same as it was, say, during Copenhagen. In fact, after Durban or since Durban, you can see that both these countries have differed on most issues, including the fact that China was now, in terms of emissions, even per capita emissions, it was almost matching the levels of the EU. And in fact, China was also, expanding its renewable energy sector like anything. So it is now, the leader when it comes to renewable energy sector. So China had already sort of, that first mover advantage and was making huge strides in many sectors. which was not the case in India. So that, of course, shows why India very often does not want to get clubbed with China. So this is an argument you would find Indian negotiators and Indian policymakers, Indian scholars making, that China's emissions are way more. Their economy is way bigger. There's so much to China, which India is still way behind in terms of the growth, GDP, the per capita income. In every terms, India is way behind even today when it comes to comparison between China and India. So you can't really compare the both. Even for that matter, you look at the political systems, the domestic climate policy. It's not as easy as you see outside. So when domestic policies in India are made on climate change, there are a lot of processes that are carried out in comparison to China, where there are processes, but it's probably much easier to implement them, as we have seen even with the net zero target. There are, of course, differing geopolitical ambitions. China today looks like it, just has this ambition of becoming a superpower, and very soon, like in a couple of decades. India is still kind of, somewhere between major power, great power. There are aspirations, and these are again, differing sort of perceptions that exist of these two countries at the geopolitical level. In terms of climate vulnerabilities, India and China both are highly climate vulnerable, but they don't seem to talk about these vulnerabilities very often at the international level when it comes to diplomacy, especially in the negotiation space. So what are the shifts that happen? So there are, all these drivers very importantly, and what are the shifts that happened over a period of time? Of course, when you look at India and China, both these countries, especially India, has always talked about the per capita principle. It did move, slightly away from that too much of emphasis on per capita to something per capita plus. That is per capita, yes, but then beyond that, what can India and how can India contribute to the global solutions on climate change? So there was this idea of responsibility and opportunity as well. Now, for both India and China, there are a lot of co-benefits of climate action. For China, of course, there's geopolitics involved in it. As much as India, cares about its reputation, there is also how it helps restructuring the economic systems within the country. For China, pollution was a huge problem, which actually India is facing today. So there are a lot of co-benefits. Even for that matter, India talks about energy self-reliance through renewable energy expansion, right? So because India is one of the largest importers of fossil fuels today. So these were some of the ideas that, of course, bring that shift in climate diplomacy itself. The other issues include knowledge. So, as the countries become more and more adept at the knowledge of climate change and what are the vulnerabilities and how you can shift to cleaner sources of energy, or how you can bring in energy transitions or other forms of transitions within societies to cope with climate change, that perceptions of vulnerability itself had a huge role to play in changing the way both these countries started looking at climate change and why they need to up their diplomatic positions at the international level also. International pressure obviously had a big role to play. I don't have to say that already since I mentioned it. There is, of course, a balancing between developing country, because, both these countries, especially 10 years ago, today, of course, China is way ahead, but then developmental imperatives are some things that cannot be compromised in the name of climate action. Now, these are issues that were raised. At the same time, balancing it with responsible power status, right? So both these countries are also very much concerned about their reputation and how they are perceived at the international level on the climate change front. There is, of course, the civilizational values and traditions. And of course, China talks about this idea of comprehensive national power, which includes, climate change as one of the major elements. For India, the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that is, world is one family. The fact that, even recently in Prime Minister Modi's speech just a couple of days ago, he mentioned how climate and environment, these are issues which are embedded in the Indian ethos itself. So this is not something that needs to be taught to us. We know how to do it, kind of targeting at the Western countries in particular. Yes, there is also economic, political, scientific, technological capacity itself. So the more you are capable of dealing with these issues and able to project yourself at the international level through economic, political, scientific, and technological capacity that also gives you an edge in terms of your negotiating positions or diplomatic positions. And of course, that shift in the image itself, right? So spoiler to bridging nation in the case of India, or in the case of China, naysayer to even being called a climate leader for that matter. And of course, the Trump factor played a huge role in projecting in China as a climate leader at one point in time. So in a way, the shift was not really about ideology. It was more about pragmatic ways of achieving their national interest at various levels of decision making. Now, as I mentioned, there are a lot of alliances and partnerships and strategic sort of partnerships that were built over a period of time, and you can see EU and the US played a big role in that. So just before the Paris Agreement was signed, in fact, President Obama visited both China and India, and he got a good deal in China, but when he visited India, he did not get the same kind of deal as on climate change, but he did get a deal at least on the Kigali Amendment to Montreal Protocol, which was a compromise made there. But these relations, like with the European Union, and which is both at the bilateral level as well as in the negotiation space itself, these have also influenced China and India's climate diplomacy over a period of time. I'm happy to answer questions on that because there's a little bit more that I need to delve into, including like the developing countries. You look at G77 plus China, India and China both are members of LMDC, the like-minded developing countries. Of course, before that it was BASIC, and then once Brazil and South Africa sort of found their own ways in the negotiation space, we found that LMDC started taking more sort of action as a joint group, and then BRICS is another group. Again, BRICS, with the exception of Russia, it's the same. Membership as far as BASIC is concerned. So all these different groupings through which again ideas of equity, historical responsibility on issues like including on transparency or MRV, various issues have been taken up, and including on like equity, for instance, right? So on all these issues, these alliances have really helped both India and China to navigate their positions in climate diplomacy. Now, the recent sort of commitments and pledges, of course, China has already sort of pledged to peak its emissions before 2030, net zero emissions target, and also increasing its renewable energy capacity. India also announced its 5-point climate agenda at the recently held COP26, but it is yet to submit it to the UNFCCC, if I'm not wrong. So I don't know if it did it today or yesterday, but as far as I know, it is yet to submit these pledges to the UNFCCC. But India did go ahead and declare a net zero target, which was unimaginable even like a few weeks ago, when everybody thought this is like an impossible task. Like India would not India would not budge under pressure from the developed countries to declare any net zero target. But we also have to realize that India is pressurized not just by the developed countries. There's a lot of pressure that also comes from developing countries. It's India's own neighbors, for instance, Bangladesh and Maldives and other developing countries have also raised concerns over why India and China are not acting enough on this issue. So yes, there are pledges and commitments which have raised expectations about where these two countries are headed in the future. Now, are they cooperating now? What is the level of climate diplomacy that they are engaging in today? As of now, there seems to be like clearly opposing visions of where they see themselves, right? So this is just one example that I would like to take, like with BRI of China and India's, grand idea of one sun, one world, one grid, right? So after the launch of the International Solar Alliance at the Paris summit in 2015, where the Paris Agreement was also signed, it was clear that India did, in fact, in many of the official statements of India, it makes the statement that this is something that is meant to counteract China's BRI, which tends to invest a lot in fossil fuels, and so we have a much more equitable and much more inclusive we have a much more inclusive sort of idea of where the world is headed and how sustainable development needs to be promoted, and all these issues. So this is how some of the official statements are worded, in fact, almost pitting India's ISA and OSOWOG to China's BRI project, which is also one of the grandest projects as far as infrastructure projects is concerned. And with the recent announcement of China's that it will not invest in coal projects abroad, we have to see, all the criticism that was leveled against China before about its, investments in fossil fuel projects is something that that we need to also look at. Now, I'll quickly wrap up and I'll, take more questions, and I'm just going to flag off a few concerns here. The future between India and China on climate change, of course, they will still find each other when they have to, put off pressure from the developed world to, announce much bigger targets or something like that, which is most likely to happen, because at the end of the day, they have to get each other's back on this issue. That is the only way, as they see themselves, even in the WTO and various other platforms as well. But you look at bilateral cooperation as well. So yeah, you have these pictures here. It shows the border tensions recently, which happened, and since then there's been a complete slump in cooperation at the bilateral level on various issues. Even on renewable energy, where the two had started cooperating in the late 2000s, you can see the dependence of India on Chinese PV, for instance, has led to a lot of problems for India rather than actually enhancing cooperation. So actually, India wants to now reduce its dependence on Chinese products like panels and solar modules and everything, because even the Indian manufacturing industry is sort of dependent on the materials, the raw materials for manufacturing solar panels. So for that matter, this puts India at a very, very difficult position rather than actually enhancing India's position. So at a bilateral level, also India is trying to sort of diversify its portfolio, see where it can get these raw materials from, maybe other countries, including, for instance, Germany, right? So there are these issues in the, I've just put this image of Quad, which has a working group on climate change as well. So India is now looking to also kind of cooperate with other countries in the region, other countries in the so-called Indo-Pacific region, where you don't have to, then you can diversify the supply chains, diversify the mineral value chain on which the world is currently dependent on. Why? Because China seems to be dominating these sectors as of now. The other factor which is going to play into Sino-Indian climate diplomacy is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic itself, and the green recovery that we are talking about. It has changed. Like the pandemic has changed the geopolitical landscape by a great deal, and it has put further pressure on tensions between India and China have further enhanced. It's not just about the political game, but also in terms of how much both countries trust each other on various issues. This has also led to a lot of problems within the climate diplomacy space. I'll stop there, and it's over to Yanka now, and I hope I didn't cross my time, and I'm happy to answer questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dhanashree. This is super fascinating, and you're very German in your timing and being spot on. So already perfectly attuned. Let me start with one question that we have you've touched upon, but maybe we can just dig a little bit deeper on it. We're in our pre-chat, we've talked about it a little bit. Now, one could argue that India had a prime opportunity at the COP in Glasgow to make China look really bad, at a time where the tension between the two countries is high, at a time when India is trying to also position itself certainly as an alternative to China, which could be economically beneficial, where Europe is quite up for that, where the relationship with the United States is a different one. So I think you have really well elaborated on why and how this kind of partnership between the two had emerged over the years, and where they differ and where they converge. But why do you think this moment wasn't seized, where it could have been an interesting little snap at China? It could have been a nice nod to the Europeans. What was the Indian government what was the rationale behind this? What was the logic behind this? And does this tell us something about how important that partnership in climate diplomacy really is for India?
Yeah, so that's a very important question. I don't know why this position was taken in the last minute, which seemed yeah, a little irrational from various perspectives. But just from my experience of looking at various positions that India has taken over a period of time in the negotiation space, you will find that India has always been a little uptight about this moral position. So that's why, when it comes to the ideological position, I think India is way more like, it takes a moral position a lot more than China does. Right. So it needs to put a certain language in the treaty itself, because it needs to abide. I mean, it needs the language which it can abide with, rather. Right. So this is something that I feel has always driven or guided India's positions on various occasions. Even at the Copenhagen summit, you see that China's positions were, I mean, India and China's positions were pretty much the same, but in the end, India was seen as the, spoiler, while, of course, China was like some behind India, so this hiding behind India is something that has happened at various conferences, including at Durban summit, for instance, when this whole MRV issue was discussed at great length. Now, the reason why this, I mean, as I mentioned, one is, like I mentioned about this morality part itself, that, I think there is a strong moral standpoint that India believes in when it comes to the negotiation space, that we want a certain language that we can abide by. That's very important. The other factor is there was, of course, there were concerns that, this is something that will be steamrolled. And this is where India needs to kind of stand its ground. Other countries may not be able to do that. So this idea also, because India had come up with grand announcements in the beginning, so maybe there was a feeling that this may not be taken as badly because of all the major announcements made at the beginning. So, but then, of course, the press and everybody else took it in a completely different light. Then there are various other issues involved here, including the fact that coal is an issue even domestically. So if I have to sort of take it down to the coal issue itself, it's a very touchy issue when it comes to the Indian domestic scenario itself. There are a lot of interests involved in the coal industry, including the and it's also important to remember that states are more involved in it than the central government. So it's not possible for the central government to again kind of roll out various policies without taking or consulting the state governments at all. So I think that is also something that ran into how India sort of wanted to put this across. But why doesn't India call out China? This is a question that I think doesn't fit only in the climate diplomacy arena, but various other arenas also. Right. So there are various issues on which India can easily call out China, but it doesn't do so because of fears that the same fingers will then be posed, at India as well. That is one of the worries that I'm sure plays into the negotiating positions. And the fact that, like, for instance, BRI, it's very, very easy to target BRI for being highly fossil fuel intensive. But then you don't do that because there are also Indian investments in coal projects abroad as well. So, you don't want to kind of rake up issues now and, kind of face the same music later on. So there are concerns with regard to these as well. So in the climate change space, it looks like, China and India would continue to cooperate because they, as I mentioned, they have to just get each other's back when the pressure sort of mounts on them. Even though, like I mentioned, India doesn't want to be clubbed with China. So there are these opposing sort of dynamics which are at play, and it's difficult to unpack it, as is, like I mentioned, there are so many things that play into it.
Super fascinating. There are, and because it's so fascinating, we have already like a number of questions coming in. So let's just go through them now. So we have a question from Mikhail Kolakovsky. That is there any significant India-China cooperation or dialogue with ASEAN on climate and energy transformation?
Yes, there is. So definitely China, I think, is a little ahead in those discussions also, because China's cooperation with ASEAN is at a very different level in terms of its economic cooperation, trade cooperation, and as well as investments in ASEAN countries is much, much higher as compared to India. So I don't think there's much of comparison there. But India also started talking about, for instance, some of the countries are part of the International Solar Alliance, like some of the ASEAN countries. But then there are also, differing views on whether countries should be part of the Solar Alliance, because, India did not sign on to RCEP. So that continues to be like a roadblock in, so, I mean, I'm not saying all these issues also impinge on climate cooperation, but they do in the end have that sort of, so some of the CMLD countries, for instance, say that since India did not sign on to RCEP, should we be then part of the ISA? We can just go ahead with our cooperation with China, Japan, and various other countries in the region itself. So I think it's important to remember that India still hasn't been able to find that balance in cooperation with South Asian neighbors. So extending it to Southeast Asia, although I think there is more cooperation with Southeast Asia than South Asian neighbors as well on many issues today. On disasters, in fact, there is a lot of cooperation with Southeast Asian countries. But when it comes to energy transitions and these issues, I think India is still figuring out the domestic scenario first, and then kind of look into external partnerships. It's actually more interested in inviting more investments and partnerships and more climate finance into the country to develop India's own energy transitions policy. Because India has just started this process, so it's going to take time before, unlike China, where renewable energy sector is huge, it's massive, right? So they are already selling the technology, they are investing in countries in renewable energy infrastructure. India is also doing that. In fact, I would like to reiterate that some of the private players in India are already doing that, which may not be directly supported by the state as such. So some of these are not state driven. So in China's case, it's much too clear, everything is state driven. But in India's case, there is a lot of private driven investments as well in renewable energy in Southeast Asia, in Africa, for instance. And now with the Solar Alliance, there is much more opportunity that is available. But as I mentioned, it still kind of lags behind China.
Yeah, this is something where the Europeans obviously smell an opportunity as well, with India investing into renewable energies much more heavily. There's a couple of European companies that sense an incredibly large market that they can tap into and be more present in as well. There's more and more questions coming, so let's maybe take two together for this round, so that we have time for all of them. So the question by Baifert Sang from E3G is, what are India's plans to reduce dependency on China with regards to solar and other green tech? Kind of concretely, where are they headed? Is it more kind of domestic development, or is it more other suppliers? And then the second question would be, did India decide to aim achieving net zero by 2070? Like adding 10 years, like China, which decided to add another 10 years versus other countries, where the majority is aiming at 2050. Basically, India asked itself, if China can buy itself 10 years, why not India too? So just kind of keep adding a little bit of this time. And maybe I can add to that question, was that clever? Or would it have been, because it's so far in the future, it probably, I mean, Narendra Modi is not going to be held responsible for the 2060 nor the 2070 goal. So diplomatically, would it have been smarter to just say 2060, or do you think that would have put too much pressure on them?
Yeah, so for the first question on India's plans to reduce dependency on China, I mean, there are structural changes. Of course, some structural changes have been brought into the system so that, subsidies, incentivization for the domestic manufacturing and all that is there. Policies have also been brought in. There are, additional sort of incentivization to medium, small, and micro enterprises that seem, that are now interested in developing green tech or renewable energy tech. But I think the problem lies in the fact that, first of all, the scale of manufacturing is pretty low in India. Even today, it's going to take a long time for us to reach the levels of China. And as I mentioned, okay, even if we are going to domestically manufacture the solar panels, we are dependent on raw materials as well. So where are we going to source them, right? So that also sometimes ends up coming from China and various other countries. So that is primarily the reason why India is interested in building partnerships rather than just building self-reliance immediately. So just to reduce dependency on China, of course, domestically, as I mentioned, there are changes that are being brought in, like tax breaks and subsidies and all that. At the same time, India is also partnering with like-minded countries, like EU is one such partner. Then you have US, Japan, all these different countries. So we have also started talking about the SCRI, right? So Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, which is also one way of reducing dependence on China for various materials, right? So supply chains, mineral value chains, all these are still dominated by China. So I think all countries are pretty much on the same boat when it comes to reducing dependency on China. So yes, through partnerships and through internal changes within the country, there are efforts being made, but yeah, it's not going to bear fruit immediately. It's going to take a little bit of time because the scale, right, the capacity is much lesser. So this is going to take a long time. The other part about India, yeah, declaring 2070, yeah, it's just smart move, right? So you're saying that developed countries are saying 2050, okay, ideally they should say 2030, right? And China is saying 2060. So looking at the economies of scale and looking at all the other factors, yeah, so might as well declare 2070, right? So 10 years further from China's target. So in terms of the target, I think it makes perfect sense, even with 2070 for that matter. If you are looking at the domestic setting right now, it's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take effort from now rather than 2050. So I don't think Narendra Modi is not going to be around in 2060 or 70. That's going to make any difference, because if he is serious about 2070, he has to start the process now, because we are still far away from so many communities that are dependent on the coal sector, the workforce that is dependent. Most the lock-in effects of the fossil fuel dependency is quite high in most of the energy systems. We are talking about states and other stakeholders who depend on the revenues that come from the fossil fuels. With all these things, it's going to take major overhaul of the energy systems within the country. So I don't think 2070 is, of course, it may be too late for the climate, but if that is the case, if it has to be accelerated, I think the priority lies in getting more and more climate finance from developed countries, private finance, whichever way possible, mobilize as much finance to accelerate the process. And for that, as I mentioned, at a very political game that India is playing, I'm sure it would wait for other developed countries to say 2030 or 40, and so that India can sort of advance it to say 2050. Yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense. I do think, and I also think that kind of this trajectory that we're now seeing with the decarbonization logic slowly kind of taking a hold of the economy, and where can you see this race to the top in a way happening already, where it becomes just economically so much more sensible to decarbonize faster, to invest more heavily into renewable energies because it's cheaper. So I think we haven't seen the end of this conversation yet, but the fact that India did set one of those goals is just another indicator of this trend, just kind of having this has gained a strong foothold. We have two more questions that I would like to do a last round with you with, if that's okay. One of them has accidentally flipped into the answered box, so I will get it out of the answered box here, from Krzysztof Zaleski from the Boehm Institute in Warsaw, who says, thank you for the fascinating introduction. Do you think that India can realistically become a leading producer and supplier of solar power generating equipment? As we know, it is a long-standing ambition, and what is standing in the way? You have answered a little bit on the kind of critical materials question, but in terms of manufacturing capacity, in general, there would be an ability to do so. So the question is, are there other holdups that we're not seeing maybe? And then we have a question here from Michał Kolakowski again. Do the AIIB and the BRICS New Development Bank play a significant role in delivering green financing for Asia? And then we have another one that is kind of around the solar question in India, and the solar question, how I'll try to summarize it a little bit, but also the question, why did India fail to build a sizable domestic solar panel industry? It does seem to be the obvious thing to do, and why did it not work out so well?
Yeah, so I think I'll probably take all these questions together, but because they all tend to focus on solar sector. So you are right. Obviously we, despite that we launched the National Solar Mission pretty much around the same time as China did. Its strategic emerging industry policy, as mentioned in the comment itself. I think, like, yeah, obviously there are, there's no stability in the industrial policy in India, right? So it keeps changing. There are a lot of interests that often come in the way as well. So every year the financial policies change. Of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, things, changed even more, in the past 1 year. But even in the last 10 years, you will find that stability in industrial policy has been extremely bad or poor in that fact, for that matter. So that really affects the way these industries, emerge. A lot of, in fact, one thing I've noticed in the past 10 years, a lot of startups have emerged in the renewable energy sector. But again, these are not large scale projects. These are small. There's a lot of projects which are rooftop solar and other types of small scale solar projects which are working really well. So there are a lot of decentralized systems in India which are working well as well. But then to make it like a large scale kind of production as China does, of course, other reasons I mentioned, including the fact that we don't have large scale manufacturing capacity, which also depends on a stable industrial policy, something that doesn't change like every year. And like, for that matter, just look at the goods and services tax, which is one of the perennial problems in reducing the bureaucratic sort of red tape itself. So red tape has been always a problem, and you think that, yeah, Modi government has tried a lot to remove the red tape as much as possible, but the bureaucracy runs in a very different way. So, we have to kind of take that decision making into consideration, that everything is not centralized. There is this feeling that, everything is centralized in India with, this Narendra Modi with this larger than thou figure. He's the one who has a lot of control over all the decision making, but in reality, the bureaucracy, the various other stakeholders have a lot of say in what goes on, which is why even today, despite all these announcements that he made at the COP, you can see that it's moving very slowly, because now he has to consult all the domestic players, all the domestic actors, and how all these major announcements are going to be achieved. And 10 years down the line, one of the targets is that we are going to have installed capacity, right, of 50% from renewable energy, right? All these are major announcements. Of course, when it comes to capacity, it may be easily attainable, but to convert that into something that contributes to electricity itself, that's going to take some time, because that also depends on the distribution companies and various other companies which are all running in huge losses, right? So that is also one of the problems. So yes, industrial capacity has not been built as much. We have Make in India program, Atmanirbharta program, various programs which also were trying to sort of build the manufacturing base, but then it hasn't taken off the way we envisaged. Some sectors are working well, including renewable energy. I would say it has moved in the right direction, but it still has a long way to go because of various concerns with regard to this. In fact, I would say even research and development in India in these sectors is pretty low. We don't invest much in R&D processes, and I think that also hampers our ability to sort of enhance our own, manufacturing itself. I think that is also an area that we need to focus on in the future. Or we are probably doing that already, but it needs to be scaled up a lot more. Yes, yeah, the other question about AIIB and BRICS new development. Yes, they are involved in green financing in many countries of Asia. I don't think I can answer that, because I answer it properly because I don't have the right kind of data or examples to show. But I know that there are a lot of projects that are funded by these two institutions as well, which is also trying to sort of I wouldn't say replace, but somewhere undermine the role of World Bank and IMF. But you look at International Solar Alliance, the biggest partner is World Bank. So, so I don't think, I think India is pretty much taking money from wherever it comes. It doesn't matter whether it's BRICS or AIIB or World Bank or whichever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't. It always has to be kind of put back into proportion. Then, if we talk about the importance of this, but the AIB, it is a bit special that India is so opposed to the Belt and Road Initiative in general, but is the largest lender of the AIB. So it is quite funny in a way to the largest taker of credits in terms of that initiative. So we have one more question here, and I would like to add a little bit to that. So the question is, do you feel that the EU is taking full advantage of frictions with China? There was a long time the perception that the EU-India partnership was declaratory. Has there been enough of a turn post 2016-17 to also offer deliverables and implementation? And I would like to add a final question to that for you. That is, if there are three things that you think the EU, having all of the Indo-Pacific strategy now, having its global gateway, which was just announced, because it's going to be 300 billion of investment that is going to be pouring out into the world now. If we see all of that happening in the EU-India connectivity partnership, what are the three things that you say, okay, that would really make a difference in terms of breaking, maybe carefully phrasing that, or kind of loosening that India-China climate partnership that we're seeing along these issues, this having each other's back on certain issues, and kind of woo India fully into a European camp? What would be three things that could be done in that regard?
Okay. So EU, I think what I see is that, yes, in a way, the tensions between various countries within the EU and China has definitely helped boost EU-India relations. That I think that is quite evident in the last 1 year when individual countries within the EU started declaring their own Indo-Pacific strategies. And then the EU also came up with an Indo-Pacific strategy just recently, right? So in fact, one of the 7 areas of, policy areas which the EU has mentioned in its strategy is, green transition and, renewable energy. All these issues are, of course, mentioned as well as sustainable development goals, Paris Agreement goals. All these are also mentioned in the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. And it also kind of re-emphasizes that India is one of the major partners that the EU wants to work with. And I think that is something that I think there lies a little bit of perceptual sort of difference here, because I feel that, India as of now, India does cooperate with the EU on various fronts, but at the same time, there are still some of these differences on, ideological sort of differences that still persist. Somewhere down the line, yes, it has moved to more pragmatic, where we can cooperate in results-oriented diplomacy, something that looks at just the outcomes and not how the processes are carried out. I think there are differences over environmental due diligence, human rights due diligence, all these issues where I think we have to sort of tread the line very carefully, because these are issues on which India doesn't want to really be, caught, if I can say. So these are some of the factors that will definitely come in the way. But I think there is enough and more scope as far as the geopolitical landscape is concerned. I think there's enough and more scope for EU-India cooperation in the future. Now, if you ask me, this is a process that started 10 years ago, but it moved in a very, very slow pace. And as far as I understood, EU-China relations, the way it evolved and mushroomed and flourished was very fast as compared to EU-India relations, because there seems to be a lot of, of course, where is the money lie, there's a lot of money in China. So that also factors into how the climate diplomacy plays as well. Now, if you ask me, what are the three things, that EU needs to, or EU can focus on and, sort of woo India away from China? I think, ideologically, we need to look at the messaging itself, right? So to show where what China's ambitions are, and with respect to climate leadership, all of that, at the end of the day, where is that ambition leading China to? And do we see India and EU going in that direction as well? Do we want to be part of that kind of a world order where China is like a superpower or whatever? I think we need to start with that question itself, which should bring the two countries, at least two parties together. If we have to look at specific sectors, I would say, of course, clean transport and energy transitions is very important. And just transition in India is a very critical area where I think EU can provide. Now that, with South Africa, a deal has been struck, I think India needs to be next in line. I think there is possibility, since at COP26, South Africa was one of the beneficiaries as well. So maybe just transitions, if India is indeed going to, go ahead with its 2070 net zero emissions target, I think just transition and clean energy is something that needs to be upscale. The other part is about industrial green industry, right? So as much as we are talking about Atmanirbharta, self-reliance, which is, and other kinds of policies, we are trying to expand our manufacturing base as well. So how do you make it green? I think that's another area where there is a lot of knowledge that is required as well. So I think that is an important factor to look into. The other is, I think, adaptation and disaster risk reduction. I think this is one area which is not actually, funnily, it's not something that is focused upon by the EU in India. And this is one area we actually, India does need a lot of financing when it comes to infrastructure, resilience, community resilience in coastal areas and various other, vulnerable regions within India. So I think adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and resilience is something that is also very much an important area to focus on within India. And this is something where India would need a lot of financial support as well. Yeah.
Tanushree, I think we have to just do this again, because we could talk for another hour and a half or two probably. So my suggestion here is we will turn this webinar into a real physical meeting early next year when you're in Berlin, and we will invite everyone who's joined us for the webinar to join us then physically in Berlin. That would be fantastic. I thank you very, very, very much for all of your exciting kind of ideas and the kind of comprehensive overview that you have provided us with. This is incredibly helpful, and this is definitely a part of the conversation that needs to take place here in Europe much more often. So I hope that we can stay in touch around this conversation and have many, many more of these conversations in the future. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Manisha Reuter and Frédéric Gras, our senior fellow Frédéric Gras in Paris, and our program coordinator of the Asia team, Manisha Reuter, for putting this together and organizing everything. I would like to thank Tanushree for taking the time with us. And as I said, I hope we can continue the conversation and have many more of these in the future. We will continue our India-China Luncheon series, which is always kind of strictly 1 hour, strictly fit for a lunch break in the next few months, and hope to see all of you again. And I wish all of you a wonderful day. Stay safe, stay healthy wherever you are, and see you soon. Thank you, Tanushree.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all the questions.